Before the war in heaven, before the Necrons, before the gods, reality was quieter, not peaceful, just stable. There was no screaming warp, no tides of emotion reshaping existence, no demons clawing at causality. The universe functioned like a closed system, matter, energy, time, entropy, all finite, all predictable. And ruling this structure were the old ones, not gods, not conquerors, but engineers of reality. They did not dominate through force. They cultivated, they seeded life across the galaxy, not for worship, not for empire, but for control, not political control, but metaphysical control. Life was their tool to regulate reality itself, because life generated something new, psychic resonance. The warp did not yet exist as we understand it. It was a shallow reflection, a dim echo of consciousness, incapable of violence or will. The old ones changed that deliberately. They uplifted species, tuned minds toward psychic sensitivity, and linked consciousness to reality like a feedback loop. To most lore summaries, this sounds benevolent: creation, guidance, enlightenment. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Warhammer lore hints at, but never states outright. The old ones were trying to escape the limits of real space. Real space was finite. They were not. The old ones had reached the ceiling of what physical reality allowed. No matter how advanced, entropy wins. Time erodes everything. They understood this. And so they began the long project of turning the warp from a reflection into an alternative. The warp was not meant to be hell. It was meant to be an exit, a realm where causality bends, where time collapses, where death has no final authority. But opening that door required pressure, psychic pressure, applied at a galactic scale, and that pressure destabilized reality. This is where the Necron enter the story, not as villains, not even as rivals, but as casualties. The Necron were born into a universe that hated them. Short lives, brutal stars, bodies rotting from radiation. They looked at the old ones and saw immortality. They begged for it. They were refused, not out of cruelty, but necessity. The old ones could not grant physical immortality without breaking the balance they were trying to transcend. So the Necron turned elsewhere, and they found the Catan. The greatest misconception in Warhammer is calling the Catan gods. They were not gods. They were constraints. They were fundamental entities tied to the laws of real space. Entropy, matter, energy, causality. They fed on stars because stars were the anchors of physical reality. The didn't rule reality. They enforced it. And when the Necron made their pact, they did not gain freedom. They bound themselves to the very prison the old ones were trying to escape. The Necrons became immortal, yes, but locked into material existence forever. No souls, no warp presence, no transcendence. This is why the war in heaven was inevitable, not because of hatred, not because of conquest, but because two factions wanted opposite futures. The old ones were trying to abandon reality. The Catan were trying to preserve it, and the Necrons were the weapon that turned philosophy into extinction. The war that followed was not fought for territory. It was fought over what existence itself was allowed to become. And before we go further, pause for half a second and ask yourself this. Do you think the old ones were right, or did they doom the galaxy the moment they decided reality wasn't enough? Drop your answer in the comments and keep listening, because the next phase of the war is where everything breaks. The war in heaven does not begin with armies. It begins with consequences. The old ones did not declare war. They continued their work, seeding psychic species, deepening the warp, pushing reality toward instability. and reality responded. The Catan did not hate the old ones. They reacted to them. As fundamental entities bound to the laws of real space, the growing psychic pressure was existentially intolerable to them. The warp was no longer a shadow. It was becoming a rival framework of existence, and the Catan could feel it destabilizing the universe they fed upon. So they did what constraints always do when threatened. They enforced order. They guided the Necrons not as generals, but as instruments. The Necron warforms were not designed for conquest. They were designed for negation. Gauss weapons did not simply kill. They erased matter's coherence. Pylons did not defend territory. They suppressed unreality. Where the old one's creations bent physics, Necron technology straightened it back into obedience. This is why the earliest battles of the war in heaven feel so asymmetric in the lore. The old ones wielded life, psychic resonance, evolving species that adapted mid-conflict. The Necrons wielded silence. They collapsed warp manifestations. They killed gods by making them irrelevant. For the first time, the old ones were not fighting an enemy. They were fighting the universe's immune response. And this forced escalation. The old ones unleashed their greatest creations, not soldiers, but living interfaces between real space and the warp. The Eldari were not meant to be warriors. They were designed to survive in the warp without dissolving into it. Krork were not meant to conquer. They were meant to apply raw, stabilizing pressure through aggression, psychic mass given direction. Even lesser species were tuned for resonance, each adding another vibration to the growing warp. But here is the critical mistake. The old ones assumed the warp would remain neutral. They believed consciousness could shape it without being shaped in return. That belief died the moment fear entered the system. War introduced terror, rage, despair, emotions amplified across a galaxy of psychic life. The warp began to reflect those emotions not passively, but actively. Weaponized fear created predators in the Imperium. The first proto-demons were not servants of chaos. They were feedback anomalies, unguided reactions to suffering on a scale reality had never experienced before. And this is where the war stops being controlled. The old ones were no longer building an escape. They were digging through a wall while the house burned behind them. The Necrons noticed this immediately, not because they understood chaos, but because warp instability interfered with their function. Real space was no longer clean. Entropy spiked unpredictably. Causality bent where it should not. This forced the Catan to commit fully. They descended into physical forms, not to rule, but to anchor reality by force. This was their fatal error. By taking shape, they made themselves divisible. By becoming present, they became vulnerable, and the Necrons, ever the tools, paid the price. The biotransference that had stripped their souls now locked them into a war where reality itself was fragmenting around them. They were winning battles. They were losing the universe. By the midpoint of the war in heaven, no side was in control. Not the old ones, not the Necrons, not the Catan. The warp had begun to awaken, and in the next phase, it will stop reacting and start deciding. By the time the war in heaven reaches its third phase, the word war is no longer accurate. This is no longer a conflict between factions. It is a system failure. The old ones realize too late that the warp has crossed a threshold. It is no longer a tool. It is no longer an escape route. It is becoming self-referential, feeding on the emotions generated by the war, amplifying them, then reflecting them back into real space as influence. This is the moment chaos is born. not as gods, not as personalities, but as processes, patterns of emotional gravity accumulating mass inside the Imperium. The Old Ones did not create chaos deliberately. They created the conditions where it was inevitable, and inevitability is more dangerous than malice. The Aeldari sense it first. They were built to survive the warp, which meant they could feel it changing. Where once it was fluid and responsive, it now had currents. Resistance, predatory intent. This is why the earliest Aeldari myths do not speak of chaos gods, but of hungers and storms, forces that pull rather than command. The Necrons misread this completely. To them, the warp's instability confirmed everything the Catan had warned. Real space must be preserved at any cost. The solution was not balance, but suppression. This is when the Great Null projects begin. Blackstone pylons, lattice networks, warp-dampening architectures on a galactic scale. These were not weapons. They were quarantine measures. The Necrons were not trying to win anymore. They were trying to lock reality in place before it tore itself apart. But suppression created a paradox. The more the warp was constrained, the more pressure built behind it, like sealing a reactor without shutting it down. The Old Ones attempted course correction. They withdrew. Some retreated beyond the galactic plane. Some folded themselves into higher dimensional refuges. Some vanished into constructs that could not be perceived by either warp or real space. This is why their disappearance is so absolute. There are no corpses. There is no final battle. Because the Old Ones did not fall. They exited, or they tried to, and here is the central lie. Chaos has inherited ever since. That it overthrew the Old Ones. Chaos did not win. The Old Ones abandoned the board because the game had become unwinnable. The galaxy they were shaping could no longer support controlled transcendence. What remained was a self-feeding immaterial ecosystem, primed to grow stronger through conflict alone. And the Necrons, watching their creators and enemies vanish, reached their own conclusion. If the warp could not be destroyed and real space could not be abandoned, then time itself had to be escaped. The Great Sleep was not retreat. It was an admission of cosmic deadlock, a bet that entropy, chaos, and life would exhaust themselves given enough millennia. The Necrons would wait, intact, unchanged, preserved in a universe that might eventually quiet again. And as the last Old Ones disappeared and the Necrons sealed their tombs, something new settled over the galaxy. Not peace, not victory, but momentum. The warp was now dominant, not because it had conquered real space, but because nothing remained capable of correcting it. And in the next part, we confront the aftermath, the galaxy that inherited a broken reality and mistook survival for triumph. When the war in heaven ends, it does not end with resolution. It ends with absence. The Old Ones are gone. The Catan are shattered, enslaved, or consumed by their own instruments. The Necrons entomb themselves. The galaxy is left alone with the consequences, and for the first time since the universe began, no one is maintaining the system. What follows is not rebuilding. It is drift. Without the Old Ones regulating psychic growth, the warp continues evolving on its own. The emotional residue of the war in heaven does not fade. It compounds. This is why chaos does not immediately dominate. It gestates. The Aeldari rise into the vacuum, not because they are strongest, but because they are compatible. They were engineered to exist in a partially broken reality. Their civilization is not an accident, it is a stress response. They master the warp because they have no alternative. But mastery is not control, it is coexistence. And coexistence with a predatory system always has a cost. The Aeldari pantheon is born here, not as gods of creation, but as psychic stabilizers, cultural anchors designed to give form to the immaterial, to prevent the warp from collapsing entirely into madness. But belief cuts both ways. The more the Aeldari rely on their gods, the more those gods rely on Aeldari emotion. This is the trap inherited from the Old Ones, repeated at a civilizational scale. The Krork follow a different path. They do not seek balance, they seek momentum. Their aggression keeps their psychic output simple, direct, and cyclic. This is why orcs endure. They do not feed the warp, complexity. They feed it noise. Even here, you can see echoes of Old One design philosophy, different solutions to the same impossible problem. Other species rise and fall, each interacting with the warp in ways that further entrench its dominance. None of them are escaping reality. They are adapting to its damage. And this sets the stage for the greatest misunderstanding in Warhammer history: the belief that chaos won. Chaos did not win the war in heaven. Chaos inherited it. It thrives not because it is supreme, but because it is uncontested. No opposing system remains. The Necrons sleep. The Old Ones are absent. The Catan are broken, and so chaos becomes the default, and then humanity appears. Not as a chosen species, not as a culmination, but as a late-stage variable born into a universe already destabilized. Humanity does not create chaos. Humanity accelerates it. Because unlike the Aeldari, humans were not designed for the warp. They evolve into it blindly, emotionally, explosively. This is why the Emperor's project matters, and why it is doomed. He is not trying to save humanity. He is trying to finish what the Old Ones abandoned, to impose structure on transcendence, to control the warp without feeding it. And in the final part, we confront the truth. This implies the war in heaven never ended. It only changed participants. The greatest misconception in Warhammer 40,000 is that the war in heaven is ancient history. It is not. It is the foundation every conflict stands on. Every war, every crusade, every demon incursion is a continuation of the same unresolved argument. Can reality be escaped without being destroyed? The Emperor understood this. This is why he feared chaos more than Xenos. This is why he rejected godhood. This is why the Webway project mattered more than the Great Crusade. He was not building an empire. He was attempting to finish the Old Ones' work without repeating their mistake. A path out of dependence on the warp, without surrendering to it. But the galaxy no longer allowed subtlety. The warp was too loud, too self-aware. The moment the Emperor acted openly, chaos reacted, not because it feared him, but because he threatened its ecosystem. The Horus Heresy is not a rebellion. It is the warp defending itself using human emotion as a weapon. And this is the final brutal irony. The Imperium, in trying to survive chaos, feeds it endlessly. War, devotion, fear, sacrifice, every tool of resistance strengthens the enemy. The Emperor is not a god, because becoming one would complete the cycle. He would stabilize chaos, not defeat it. A new anchor in the Imperium, repeating the Aeldari tragedy at a human scale. And so he remains trapped, neither alive nor dead, functioning as a wound in reality, rather than its solution. The Necrons, awakening now, understand this more clearly than any living species. They are not returning to conquer. They are returning to enforce silence again. Blackstone is not anti-chaos ideology. It is anti-transcendence technology, a desperate attempt to reset the conditions of existence itself. This is why Guilliman cannot fix the Imperium. This is why hope in Warhammer is always temporary. The galaxy is not decaying. It is oscillating between two impossible states: material stagnation or immaterial annihilation. And no one has found a third option. The old ones tried to escape reality. The Catan tried to preserve it. Chaos tries to consume it. The Imperium tries to endure it. And the war in heaven continues, because the question it began has never been answered. If reality is a prison, should it be escaped, or is trying to leave what doomed the galaxy in the first place? That is the real war, and it is still being fought.